So about a year and a half ago, I made this video.
The skyrocketing cost of living.
I was skipping meals because I was struggling to afford my food and my rent.
The video went viral and talked about Canada's record population growth during Trudeau's term in office. But since I made that video, Canada has made a 180-degree turn. Last year, Canada's population growth was negative for the first time since modern record-keeping began. And this is more significant than you may think. Canada's strategy for growing its economy has long relied on having a growing population. This was one of the defining features of the Canadian model. Now, the country is deliberately slowing that growth down. Will that help solve the housing crisis and improve affordability? This is Canada's growth model with hindsight. Canada is in a very unique position. These last couple of years, immigration has been handled very poorly. But what we could see in the past is that they successfully used immigration as a tool for nation building and to help grow their economy. But today, most of the pressures of the failed immigration policies are felt with housing. Rental prices are a major topic, and in the 2 years with record population growth, they rose with close to 10% per year. Later in this video, I'll show whether the moment population growth slowed coincided with rising or lowering home prices. So I'm gonna work towards that negative population growth and whether that is actually having a positive or a negative impact on life for ordinary Canadians. But first, we must look at this with some perspective. Canada once looked like this. At the start of the 20th century, most Canadians lived close to the American border, while vast areas of the prairies remained sparsely populated. Canadian leaders wanted to settle this region, and so they encouraged immigration. They actively recruited Europeans, mostly Brits, and in the years before World War I, hundreds of thousands of people migrated to Canada year after year, causing a chain reaction. These immigrants justified building new railroads, towns, and they increased demand for homes and services. Population growth created economic growth, and Canada in the following years decided to double down on this strategy. An average woman in 1960 would have nearly 4 babies on average. But then something remarkable happened. Canada's fertility rate dropped from almost 4 in 1960 to less than 2 by the mid-1980s. And while this had many reasons, the main one was the introduction of the birth control pill. This worried policymakers. Canada's population was no longer growing naturally, and population growth had contributed much to the nation's past economic growth. Now, immigration was increasingly seen as a tool to create prosperity. A person needs a home. The bank earns a profit on charging interest, the construction of that home creates jobs, and resource companies profit from supplying the raw materials. Adding more people expands economic activity, causing a chain reaction that supported industries nationwide. That person would then pay taxes and increase demand locally and more broadly for infrastructure. And he worked. Brian Mulroney came to power, and fearing an aging population, a shrinking workforce, and diminishing government revenues, he set the policy tone for the years to come. During his term in office, immigration to Canada increased substantially, and the informal target had become to grow Canada's population by 1% per year. This was the Canada that Trudeau inherited.
And that's why today we celebrate the fact that Canada now counts 40 million people.
But does simply stopping population growth actually improve affordability? So this video doesn't have a sponsor, but I do have some very exciting news to share with you. For the last couple of months, I've been working in secret on a second YouTube channel. And right now, if you just give me 1 second, we are officially live. The first video on the second channel is right now live on the channel, and at the end of this video I'll tell you a little bit more about what I've been working on, what kind of videos I'm going to be publishing on this second channel, and who I'm making these videos for. So stick around until the end of this video to see that, and let's now go back to Canada. The Canadian growth model has worked for many decades, but with a distinct character. The size of the Canadian economy has increased roughly sixfold since 1960, but the wealth generated per Canadian has almost tripled. The difference between these two lines is in large part the consequence of population growth. And that is meaningful. A bigger economy is more resilient. It increases government revenues, and this could help boost investment. But people want to feel like they are advancing. And now, look at this. The white line is how real wages developed over time. They barely moved. While the red line are how home prices have increased over that same period. This is deeply problematic.
House prices in Canada are dropping and sales are at a 20-year low.
The financial crisis should have been a warning. For years, Canada had relied on housing, construction, and population growth as engines of economic growth. When the global financial system collapsed in 2008, many countries experienced deep housing corrections. But in Canada, that correction never occurred. This had many reasons. One of them being that banks in Canada didn't mess up as badly as in other parts of the world. But another reason was that Canada's population growth continued adding demand. Policymakers kept growth near that target of 1% per year. This was for about a third driven by natural increases and about 2/3 through immigration. But something had now changed. During the post-war years, Canada actively encouraged population growth through immigration, and these policies were matched with equally ambitious nation-building projects. These were the years that Canada's major cities expanded with suburbs, and this activity and these infrastructure investments translated into prosperity. But in the modern era, this looked very different. Population growth accelerated, but housing construction remained mostly stable. Canada controls a huge area of land, and they are one of the most sparsely inhabited countries in the world. But most newcomers settled in the same few places.
And they seem to always come to Toronto. Maybe we need to encourage them to go to different areas in the country.
Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and a handful of other major cities.
But they come to where their communities are, they come to where their networks are, they come to where the jobs are.
We also have to acknowledge the fact that our social services are also stressed.
The housing market in Canada became so overheated that it got headlines around the world. Similarly, the number of job vacancies had been rising for years, but during the pandemic, there were more than 1 million open vacancies.
You solve the labor shortage problem here, and you create a housing problem there. Yeah. You solve the housing problem here, and you create a labor shortage problem.
At the same time, colleges nationwide were struggling. Travel restrictions had caused a decline in international students, and many of these schools had become financially dependent on international students, who often pay 3 to 5 times more than Canadian students. If we look more closely at this chart, we can see that most population growth during Trudeau's tenure was driven by temporary residents. These were mostly students and temporary workers. We can also see that over that period, natural increase declined substantially and regular immigration increased. This was all the result of policy decisions that was motivated by practical considerations, just like Canada had done in the past. But this time, it was not working. So we now know why that was a bad idea that was even worse in its execution. But the million-dollar question today is, how can Canada once more become prosperous? The housing crisis isn't caused by immigration. It is driven by housing supply failing to keep pace with population growth, and the entire system is dysfunctional. In Ottawa, the federal government controls immigration, which determines how many people arrive, while provincial and municipal governments control most housing policy. This system creates a gap in oversight between supply and demand. In Trudeau's Canada, the federal government decided to rapidly increase population growth. The local governments then had to supply the housing, and for many reasons, this didn't work. In many major cities, the average approval time before construction of a housing development can begin is well over a year. In Toronto, developers spend on average 2.7 years navigating the municipal approval process before construction can begin, which means that a rapid increase of newcomers is unlikely to be met with a rapid response in new housing development. So that is the supply side of the equation. Housing affordability, in theory, can then be solved by either increasing supply or lowering demand, which in this case means to cut immigration. And that is what they did.
Today, we're announcing that we will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years, which will result in a pause in the population growth over the next 2 years.
Returning to this graph, in 2025, Canada's population shrunk for the very first time since modern record-keeping began. And this was mostly driven by a reduction of temporary residents. Natural increase is still low, and immigration is still relatively high. This coincided with home prices dropping substantially. See this chart. Home prices were already trending down since that peak during the pandemic, but in 2025, they decreased at a rate that was unmatched anywhere in the Western world. Compare housing inflation to other countries that year, and Canada with 4% saw the sharpest drop in home prices. And this is a sign that Canada's housing market is finally starting to cool down. It is not just sales. Rents are also dropping substantially.
Rent prices are finally starting to fall after a steep and punishing climb.
Home sales were down in May, 5% from the year before.
Remember this chart from the beginning. After Trudeau announced slowing population growth, which were policies that Mark Carney inherited and continued, average rent prices have declined substantially. This doesn't mean that housing in Canada is suddenly affordable, and their housing market is still red hot, and Canadian cities are amongst the most expensive to live. But the data shows that Canada's housing market is trending towards becoming slightly more affordable. And Canada is now a different place. The number of job vacancies dropped to about 500,000 today. Colleges are changing their funding model to reduce their dependence on international students. And the Canadian economy is no longer in recovery mode.
So what we're seeing in Canada today is that many of the short-term pressures on the economy that justified some of the rapid population growth in the last 5 to 10 years have now been somewhat eased. But the problem is that many of the long-term pressures still exist, like an aging population and, most of all, weak economic growth. But at least what makes me feel positive is that some of the most pressing concerns that are the housing market are trending in the correct direction. And housing is really the cornerstone of building a more prosperous and more just society.
Slowing population growth helps ease some of the pressure, and that is much needed. But if Canada wants to be rich again, it has to rediscover something that it once did remarkably well. When settlers arrived in the prairies, Canada built railroads, towns, and industries. When the baby boom transformed the country, Canada built homes, suburbs, and infrastructure. Population growth did not directly result in economic growth. What it did is that it created demand. But it was nation building that turned that demand into prosperity.
So that concludes the Canada video, and let me talk to you a little bit about the new channel. So I'm genuinely excited and a little bit nervous that the first video is currently online. I published it about 10 to 15 minutes ago, and it doesn't have any views yet, and the channel doesn't have any subscribers yet, but you could be the first, and let me show you how you can find it. If you go to the channel homepage of Hindsight and you scroll down, you'll find this featured segment with the new channel C2 Center. The channel will feature history videos about power, control, and crisis, and the first video is currently online. This one talks about a defining moment in the modern history of Russia, when Boris Yeltsin attacked parliament with tanks in Moscow. So the videos that I'm going to be publishing on this channel are going to be short history documentaries. So if you're a history buff, this channel could be for you. So I believe that I found kind of a unique format. Each of these videos is very cinematic in the way that the story is told, and they have sort of a literary quality. And another thing like that you already know from Hindsight is that all of these videos are packed with suspense. I'm very excited to share this with you, and once again, to find it, go to the Hindsight channel homepage and scroll down to Featured and click on C2 Center. And while you're there, maybe you can become my first subscriber. Who knows? Thank you as always for your precious support.